For all the non-photographers, non-videographers out there, we're talking about wedding venues, wedding coordinators, wedding planners, florists, etc. Do you need a photography release in your client contract? We're going to answer that question in this episode. Stick around.
This is the Wedding Industry Law Podcast, a podcast dedicated to wedding professionals that are just trying to keep it legal. And now, your host, Rob Shank.
Hey out there, welcome to the show. This week we're talking about the concept of a photo release and whether professionals that are not photographers and not videographers, again, we're talking about DJs, planners, things like that, whether you could benefit from having a photo release in your contract. We're going to get all into what is the release, who does it cover, what does it protect, what are the intentions of that term, and whether ultimately you may or may not need one. Before we get into that, though, be sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from, and mosey on over to our YouTube channel at Wedding Industry Law. Be sure to comment, like, and subscribe there as well. Okay. What is a photo release? A photo release or a model release is essentially a contract term, or it can be the contract itself, but essentially it is the individual that is appearing in the photograph is giving someone else the right to use their likeness and their appearance as it appears in that photograph. This is something altogether different than copyright or the right to publish a photo itself. Set that aside for a second. This is just a model release dealing with the concept of likeness, what someone looks like, their identity, their appearance, their face. So why is the release important? Like, why do we need to distinguish the ability to publish a photograph from the ability to use the likeness of someone as it appears in the photograph? The reason is simple. Everybody has the right to their own image, their own identity, their own likeness, as we call it. It is a right that everybody has, regardless of who you are. Depending on what state you're in, that right might be stronger than other states, but typically everybody has a right to appropriate or use their own image or likeness. It's the reason why typically I couldn't go up to Harry Styles, take his picture, and then put it on a t-shirt and sell Harry Styles t-shirts. Only Harry Styles can do that. And the reason why is because he has his own right to exploit his own likeness, his own image, his own quote unquote brand, so to speak. Now, again, just because you're not Harry Styles doesn't mean you have any less of a right to your image or likeness, depending on what state you're in. And that is exactly what the model release is dealing with. It is protecting the person that wants to use that image from any potential lawsuits from the person appearing in the image for misappropriation of likeness or invasion of privacy. The release allows you to utilize the person's image or likeness that appears in the photograph. Now, really quickly, this is a concept that is separate and apart from copyright, which boils down to the right to utilize the image in the first place. We'll get to that in a second. The photo release, quite simply, is allowing you to use the likeness of the person who appears in the image itself. Hopefully, I'm not getting too boiled down in the weeds on this, but that's from a broad standpoint, that is what the release is doing. So should you, as a planner, coordinator, florist, caterer, DJ, whoever, should you have some type of photo or model release in your client contract? The shorter answer is, if you intend to photograph the clients, you intend to photograph that event, then the answer is probably yes. You want that protection because ultimately your clients are probably going to be appearing in those images, and you want, at the minimum, the right to exploit their likeness if they appear in those images. So long story short, yes. But hang on though. Who does the release apply to? The release typically is going to apply to the person that is agreeing to it and is signing it. For the most part, that is the clients. So the individuals, the couple, so to speak, that's agreeing to the contract with you, if you're a caterer, planner, whatever the case is, those are going to be the people that have the ability to sign away those privacy or those likeness rights. In other words, a couple is typically not going to be able to sign away the rights of privacy to the other guests at the wedding. So simply for the fact that you have a contract with the release that covers likeness with the clients doesn't mean that you can go up and take a picture of every event guest and utilize their likeness, if that makes sense. We will get into the concept of likeness, misappropriation, and rights of privacy with regard to taking pictures of guests in a future episode. But by and large, the release is only going to be good for the person that is literally signing it with you. So you will be safest taking pictures and utilizing the likeness of the person who has signed that agreement with you. Fantastic, Rob. Great. Release allows you to use a likeness. So what are some other considerations that may appear in the release that helps further protect the individual wedding professional that is wanting to take pictures at the event? Number one is you want to define the scope of use. And what I mean by that is you want to make sure the client understands how their likeness is going to be used in those images. Are you going to put those pictures on city buses? Are you going to put them on your website, brochures? Make sure that it is specified where these images are going and what you intend to do with them as best that you can. If you are old like me, then you recall a show called Friends, in which there was one friend who was a model, Joey, in other words. And so Joey did some type of photo shoot and then ended up being the face of, I believe, herpes all around New York. He was in a bunch of PSAs for like STD awareness, and he didn't know that was going to happen. That's the type of situation that your clients are wanting to avoid. So having a scope of what you're intending to do with the images is very important, because simply for the fact that you have a release does not mean that you can do whatever you want with that person's likeness. Let them know what you're doing. Define the scope of how you're going to be using their images. Now, the next thing is, from a broad standpoint, simply for the fact that you are at the event and you're not the photographer, you're not the videographer, simply for the fact that you're at the event doesn't necessarily give you the right to take pictures in the first place. So typically in the release portion of a client contract, you can put something along the lines of, you're authorizing me to take photos in the first place. You're going to allow me to take photos for my own marketing purposes, online, offline, etc. In other words, authorization to even pull a camera out and take a picture in the first place. And I'll do you one even better, is that if this is something that you're interested in, you address it here, but oftentimes we want to have our own set photographers appear at the event. And that's possible for you to do, but the client needs to give you permission to do that. And typically you can do that within the language of the release, within the term that the release sits. So allowing you to bring a set photographer in to take the images of you doing the job or whatever the case may be. A corollary to that, though, is you need to make sure that the client, if that's what you want, you need to make sure the client understands that, and make sure that the client is agreeing that that's not going to run afoul of any other contract they might have with the principal photographer. We've all heard the stories the past maybe 4, 5, 6 years where a photographer who has the exclusive right to photograph an event runs into the DJ who's hired his or her own set photographers to take pictures of the event, and they're threatening to sue one another or go home or this type of thing. So you want to make sure that if you want to have a set photographer or you want your own pro photos of the event, you need to clear that with the client, who needs to clear that with the principal photographer right up front. Just take care of all that stuff before the event. But the only reason why I'm bringing that up is because usually this language appears in the client contract under the kind of the release language. It's all kind of goes together. And then another thing to consider within the release, and we talked about this earlier, is that you want to be the copyright owner of the images. Typically, y'all, the individual that takes the image is typically by default the copyright holder. However, there are exceptions to that. If you're an employee, if you're in some type of independent contractor relationship in which you've contracted away that right, and sometimes there might be gray areas when it comes to vendors working a wedding. So just bypass all the muckety muck, all the gray area, and establish in the contract with the client that whatever images that you're going to take, you're going to be the copyright owner of them. Okay, so I know that the intellectual property lawyers are screaming at me right now. However, just take care of it within your client contract. Even though it's possible that it might be by default, you are the copyright owner, but you want to dispel any misrepresentations, any gray area with that. And then another thing, and this is kind of separate and apart from the release, but I did want to address it in this episode since we're talking about photographs. But more often than it's comfortable for me, I have my clients, wedding professionals, come to me and go, well, Rob, I just have the client give me the photos that they get from the principal photographer. This is highly risky behavior. And the reason why it's highly risky is because the client oftentimes doesn't know what rights they have in the images they get from the principal photographer at the wedding. The client might not be able to give other people the images from their wedding. It might only be for private use with their client contract with the principal photographer. So if the client gives you images that they got from the principal photographer and you use them, you might be sued for copyright infringement. But who knows? You might also be sued for misappropriation of likeness. I don't know. But do not assume that because you got the client's permission, you can use the principal photographer's pictures. Okay. By the same token, just because you got permission from the photographer to use the images doesn't necessarily mean that that photographer did a good job with their photo release, and you might be sued for misappropriation of likeness or invasion of privacy. So the best thing to do is to get that all covered through your contract with the client itself, him or herself. Okay. So using the photographer's images without the photographer's permission, bad. Using the photographer's images with the client's permission may be good or bad depending on the contract the client has with the photographer. So we're going into a deep well. I don't want to get any further down the well, but just don't do it. Okay. Make sure that if you're going to use images, you've cleared it with all the appropriate parties. That is to say, the person that took the image and the people that appear in the image. So releases, who knows? Do you guys, whoever's listening to this, let me know. Do you have a photographic release, a model release in your client contract? Let me know. This could be something where it's like, man, I never thought about that. Or Rob, this is dumb that you're even having an episode about this because we all know this and we've been doing it for years. Who knows? So I hope that you found this episode informative. If you would like to know more about releases or like more episodes geared toward this area of contracts, let me know in the comments. Be sure to like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. And with that, folks, we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Wedding Industry Law Podcast. This podcast is intended for general information only. Nothing in this podcast is intended to be legal advice. Do not rely on this podcast for your legal matter. Instead, consult an attorney in your area. Thanks, obrigada, até semana que vem.